My daughter-in-law threw her dirty underwear, stained clothes, and filthy laundry straight onto my bed and looked me dead in the eyes before calling. The maid. Then, she tossed a stack of unpaid bills onto my kitchen table and told me I needed to start earning my keep. I was 71 years old, a widow, and the woman who had opened every door in that house to her when she had nowhere else to go. I had fed her children, washed their clothes, paid their bills, covered their groceries, and handed her family thousands of dollars without ever demanding a single cent back. Yet somehow, after only a few months under my roof, she had convinced herself that I was the servant and she was the owner. She rearranged my kitchen, moved my late husband's belongings, invited strangers into my living room, spent money she claimed we didn't have, and even told her mother that my house would eventually be hers anyway. What she didn't know was that the deed had never belonged to her, not even for 1 second. The mortgage was paid off. The house was mine. Every wall, every room, every piece of land beneath it belonged to me. And while she was busy treating me like hired help, I was quietly collecting every bill, every receipt, every unpaid loan, every piece of evidence, and every word she thought I would never hear. She thought she was living in her house. She had no idea she was living in mine. And when I finally placed that folder on the kitchen table and told her exactly what was about to happen, the look on her face told me she finally understood one terrifying truth. She had mistaken my kindness for weakness, and she was about to discover just how expensive that mistake could become. Before I tell you what happened, I want to know something. Where are you watching from tonight? Put your city in the comments. I read every single one of them, and it means the world to an old woman like me to know who's sitting with her while she tells her story. And if you love your grandma, even a little bit, do an old lady a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now, pull up a chair, get comfortable, maybe make yourself a cup of something warm, because this one is going to take a while, and I promise you, from the very first word to the very last, it is worth every single minute. My name is Linda Carter. I am 72 years old, and I have lived in this house for 41 years. My husband Robert and I bought this place back when the street was nothing but dirt and half-built foundations. We raised our son Mark in this house. We buried Robert's mother from this house. We hosted every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday party under this roof. When Robert passed 6 years ago, I made a promise to myself that I would keep this house standing, keep it warm, keep it exactly the way he loved it. I never imagined that the biggest threat to that promise would come from someone I welcomed into my own family with open arms. Mark is my only child. He was a good boy growing up, a little quiet, always polite, the kind of son who called his mother every Sunday even after he moved out for college. I was proud of him. When he met Ashley at a friend's wedding 8 years ago, I was happy for him. She was pretty, she was charming in that way that some people are charming, all smiles and compliments. When she wanted something and cold silence, when she didn't get her way, though I didn't see that side of her at first. Nobody ever does, not in the beginning. That's the whole trick of it. Let me tell you a little more about this house before I go on, because you need to understand what it means to me for the rest of this story to make sense. Robert and I bought this lot back when I was 26 years old, freshly married, with nothing but a small savings account and a lot of stubborn hope. He was a carpenter by trade, and he built half the shelving and cabinetry in this house with his own 2 hands over the course of our first 10 years together. I remember him coming home every evening covered in sawdust, grinning like a boy, telling me about the crown molding he'd finally gotten right in the dining room. We didn't have much money in those early years. We ate a lot of beans and rice, and I sewed my own curtains because we couldn't afford the ones in the store. But every single thing in this house, every board, every nail, every dollar of the mortgage, was earned through decades of hard, honest work. The kind of work that doesn't announce itself, that simply shows up every single day whether you feel like it or not. We paid off the mortgage completely 11 years before Robert passed. I remember the day the final payment cleared. He took me out to the little Italian place on Main Street, The one that's closed now? And he raised his glass of water, because neither of us ever did care much for wine. And he said, Linda, this house is ours. Free and clear. Forever. I have never forgotten those words. Free and clear forever. That phrase became something almost sacred to me in the years after he died. A kind of promise I made myself to protect, no matter what came my way. No matter who walked through that front door claiming to need shelter under my roof. And no matter how much I loved them while they were standing there asking. They got married in a small ceremony 2 years after they met. I paid for half of it because Mark was still finishing his degree and money was tight. I didn't mind. That's what mothers do. I stood in the front row and cried happy tears and told myself, I was gaining a daughter, not losing a son. I want you to remember that feeling I had that day, because it matters for what comes later. For the first few years, things were fine. Mark and Ashley lived across town in a rented apartment. They had 2 children, my grandchildren, a boy named Tyler and a girl named Emma. I loved those babies from the moment they were born. I babysat every chance I got. I never once said no when Ashley called and said she needed help. I told myself that was just what family did for each other. Then, about a year and a half ago, everything changed. Mark's company went through layoffs and he lost his job. Ashley worked part-time at a boutique downtown, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover their rent, their car payments, and the bills for 2 young children. They fell behind. Then they fell further behind. I remember the night Mark called me, his voice shaking, telling me they were 3 months behind on rent and the landlord was talking about eviction. I didn't even think twice. I told him to come home. I have 5 bedrooms in this house and only one of them was being used, mine. I told him there was more than enough room for all 4 of them, and that they could stay as long as they needed to get back on their feet. I meant it with my whole heart. I thought I was saving my family from a hard time. I never once imagined I was opening my door to the worst year of my life. They moved in on a Saturday in March, I remember, because I had made a pot roast that day, the same recipe Robert used to love. And I set the table with the good dishes because I wanted it to feel like a celebration, not a rescue. Mark hugged me so tight at the door that I could feel him shaking. Ashley smiled and thanked me and told me how grateful she was, how she didn't know what they would have done without me. Tyler and Emma ran through the house shrieking with excitement, picking out which rooms they wanted. For about 2 weeks, it really did feel like a blessing. I thought, this is what family is for. The first thing that changed was small enough that I almost didn't notice it. Ashley started leaving dishes in the sink instead of washing them, telling me she'd get to them later. Later never came. I'd walk into my kitchen in the morning to find a sink full of dirty plates and pans from the night before, crusted over, and I would quietly wash them myself before I even had my coffee. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. New parents are tired. I understood that. Then it was the laundry. At first, Ashley would ask if she could throw a load in with mine since she didn't know how the machine worked yet. I showed her twice. She never learned it, or she pretended not to. I couldn't tell which. Within a month, she stopped asking altogether. She would just leave baskets of dirty clothes outside the laundry room door and expect them to be clean and folded by the time she needed them again. I did it anyway. I told myself I was helping. It was around the 2-month mark that I noticed she had stopped saying thank you. Not just to me, but to everyone. She would ask Mark to bring her something and not even look up from her phone when he handed it to her. She would tell the children to be quiet without a single please. I noticed it, but I still didn't say anything, because I kept thinking of her as tired, overwhelmed, going through a hard transition. I was making excuses for her before I even realized that's what I was doing. The real shift happened around month 3, when Mark finally found a new job. It wasn't as good as his old one. Less pay, longer hours, but it was something, and I was so relieved for him. I threw a little dinner to celebrate. I made his favorite chicken parmesan, and I bought a bottle of sparkling cider since none of us really drink. Ashley barely touched her plate. She spent most of the dinner on her phone, and when I asked her gently if everything was all right, she looked at me like I had interrupted something important and said, I'm just busy, Linda. Not everyone has time to sit around all day like you do. I remember that moment very clearly because it was the first time she had ever spoken to me that way. Not warmly like the daughter-in-law, who used to text me recipes and ask for my opinion on paint colors, but sharp, dismissive, like I was beneath her notice. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to say something, anything. He just kept eating and said nothing at all. That silence from my own son hurt almost as much as her words did, though. I didn't fully understand yet how much silence he would offer in the months to come. After that dinner, things changed quickly. It was as if some invisible wall had come down, and she no longer felt she needed to pretend around me. She started giving me instructions instead of asking for favors. Linda, the kids need lunch by noon. Linda, can you have the laundry done by tonight? I have somewhere to be. Linda, this bathroom smells. Can you take care of it? I want you to understand something. This was my house. My name on the deed. My name on the mortgage that I had already paid off years before they ever arrived. And somehow, within a few months, I had become an unpaid servant in my own home. There were other things too, small things that piled up like snow before an avalanche. Ashley started rearranging my kitchen without asking, moving Robert's old coffee mug, the chipped blue one he drank from every morning for 30 years, into a cabinet in the garage because she said it didn't match the aesthetic she was going for. I found it 3 days later while looking for something else, and I cried in the garage for 10 minutes before I composed myself enough to walk back inside. She started inviting her friends over on weekends without ever mentioning it to me first, and I would come downstairs to find 4 or 5 young women I had never met sitting in my living room, drinking wine, using my good glasses, while I quietly retreated to my bedroom, because nobody had thought to introduce me or ask if it was all right. Once I overheard her telling one of those friends, a woman named Kelly, I believe, that the house was kind of outdated, but that she and Mark planned to redo everything eventually, as though the timeline of my own home's future had already been decided without a single conversation with me, the person whose name was on every legal document connected to it. Another time, my favorite armchair, the one by the window where I liked to read in the evenings, the one Robert had given me for my 60th birthday, ended up pushed into a corner of the sunroom because Ashley wanted the living room to have, in her words, better flow for entertaining. I moved it back 3 times. 3 times it ended up in that corner again before I finally stopped fighting that particular battle, though I noted it quietly, alongside everything else. I also started noticing something troubling about money, though it would take me a while longer to understand the full shape of it. Ashley had opened a credit card using our shared home address not long after they moved in, and packages started arriving several times a week. New clothes, shoes, home decor items still in their boxes, stacked in the hallway outside the guest room. Meanwhile, she was telling Mark and telling me that they simply didn't have enough money that month to contribute anything toward groceries or the rising electric bill from running the air conditioning constantly for the children. I said nothing at the time. I simply watched, the way you watch weather building on the horizon, waiting to see which direction the storm would actually take. I started keeping a mental note of things, not because I planned revenge yet, not at that point, but because a small voice inside me was starting to whisper that something was deeply wrong with this picture. I ignored that voice for a long time because I loved my son and I loved my grandchildren, and I told myself that families go through hard seasons, and this was just one of them. The turning point, the moment that changed everything, happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the fall. I remember the weather because the leaves outside my bedroom window had just started turning that deep orange color Robert always loved. I had spent the morning at a doctor's appointment. Nothing serious, just a routine checkup. But I came home tired and looking forward to lying down for a bit before starting dinner. I opened my bedroom door and found a pile of Ashley's dirty laundry, dumped directly onto my bed. Not folded, not in a basket, just thrown there in a heap. Some of it still damp, some of it stained, right on top of my white comforter, the one Robert had bought me for our 30th anniversary. I stood in the doorway staring at it for a long moment, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I went downstairs and found Ashley in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone at the counter, a cup of coffee I hadn't made for her sitting beside her. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, why her laundry was on my bed. She didn't even look up right away. When she finally did, she rolled her eyes like I had asked something ridiculous. I needed somewhere to put it while I cleaned the guest room, she said. It's not a big deal, Linda. Just move it. That's kind of your job around here anyway, isn't it? I asked her what she meant by that. She actually laughed. A short, sharp little laugh, like I had said something funny. I mean, you don't work, you don't do anything all day. You're basically the maid at this point, so I figured you wouldn't mind. Then, she picked her coffee, back up and went back to her phone, as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my kitchen. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it. I was 71 years old at the time. I had raised her husband from a newborn baby into a grown man. I had opened the doors of my own house, the house I built a life in with my husband, the house that was paid off with decades of our labor, and I had done it without asking for a single dollar in return. And she called me the maid. In my own home. Like, I was hired help who happened to also cook her dinner and wash her underwear for free. I did not scream. I did not cry, not in front of her anyway. Something in me went very still and very quiet, the way the air gets still right before a storm rolls in. I simply said, "Get your laundry off my bed, Ashley," and I walked away before she could see what was happening on my face. I went out to the backyard instead, where Tyler and Emma were playing on the old swing set Robert had built for Mark when he was a boy, the same one I had kept standing all these years, repainted every few summers, waiting patiently for grandchildren who eventually did come along to enjoy it. Emma, who was 5 at the time, saw my face and asked, in that direct way small children have, "Grandma, why do you look sad?" I told her I was just tired, and I sat down on the old wooden bench nearby and watched them play for a long while, letting the sound of their laughter slowly untangle some of the tightness in my chest. I thought, sitting there, about all the years I had spent in that very yard. Teaching Mark to ride a bike on the gravel path along the side of the house. Hosting Robert's 40th birthday party, under a string of lights we'd hung between the oak trees. Sitting with Robert on quiet summer evenings after Mark had gone off to college, just the two of us, watching fireflies and talking about nothing in particular, comfortable in the kind of silence only 40 years of marriage can build. This house, this yard, every square foot of it, held pieces of my whole life inside it. Pieces of a man I had loved and lost. Pieces of a childhood I had worked so hard to give my son. And in the space of one careless sentence, spoken over a cup of coffee she hadn't even made herself, Ashley had reduced all of it, all 40 years of it, down to the word maid, as though none of that history, none of that labor and love, meant anything at all beyond the free housekeeping she felt entitled to. Watching Tyler push his little sister on the swing, laughing, calling out higher, higher, I made myself a quiet promise in that backyard. Whatever happened next, however this eventually resolved itself, I was not going to let that word define how the rest of my life in this house would go. I was not going to become smaller, more apologetic, more invisible, just to keep an uneasy peace with someone who had shown me, quite clearly, exactly how little regard she held for the woman who had opened every door in this house to her, family without a second thought. That night I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling. I thought about calling my sister, my only real confidant since Robert passed. I thought about crying it out and letting it go, telling myself she was young and thoughtless, and it wasn't worth the family conflict. But somewhere around 2 in the morning, something shifted in me. I stopped feeling sorry for myself and I started feeling something else. Entirely. Clarity. I want to explain something to you about how I grew up, because it matters for what I did next. My mother used to say that quiet women are dangerous women, because they've learned to plan instead of react. I had spent months reacting with patience, with silence, with excuses. That night, lying awake in my own bed that still smelled faintly of someone else's dirty laundry, I decided it was time to stop reacting and start planning. The next morning, I did something I had never done before in the entire time. Mark and Ashley had lived under my roof. I started paying attention, really paying attention, not just to what was happening in my house, but to the money. I want you to understand something important. During all those months, I had been the one quietly covering almost everything. The property taxes, though the mortgage itself was long paid off, I handled without a word. The homeowner's insurance, in my name. The electric bill, the water bill, the gas bill, all still coming to my name because the house was mine, and I had simply been paying them out of habit and love, never once asking Mark or Ashley to contribute a cent, even after Mark got his new job. I had also, without really thinking about it as a loan or a gift, given them money more than once. $600 for Tyler's school supplies and a new winter coat. $400 when Ashley said the car needed a repair. $2,000, the largest amount, when they said they were catching up on old debts from before they moved in. Debts they promised they would pay me back once Mark's new job stabilized. Not 1 cent of that had ever come back to me, and not once had anyone thanked me for it after the first few weeks. I sat down at my kitchen table that Wednesday morning with a notepad and a pen, the old-fashioned way, because I wanted to see it all written out in front of me in black ink. I wrote down every bill, every gift, every unpaid loan, every month of free rent, free food, free childcare, free laundry service that I had provided without asking for a single thing in return. By the time I finished, the number on that page was well over $11,000, not counting the value of a roof over their heads for 8 months. I looked at that number for a long time. Then I looked around my kitchen, my house, the home Robert and I built brick by brick, and I made a decision. I was not going to yell. I was not going to throw them out onto the street in a fit of anger, no matter how much some petty part of me wanted to in that moment. I was going to do something far more effective. I was going to let the truth do the work for me. Because the truth, when you finally let it out into the light, is the sharpest weapon a quiet woman has. Over the following 2 weeks, I did not change my behavior on the surface. I still cooked dinner. I still did the laundry, though I made sure never to touch a single item of Ashley's clothing again. Not one sock, and when she noticed and complained, I simply said I had a lot on my mind lately, which was true, though not in the way she assumed. I still smiled at family dinners, but underneath that calm surface, I was moving pieces into place like a general preparing for a battle nobody else in that house knew was coming. First, I called my nephew David, who happens to be a family law attorney 2 towns over. I hadn't spoken to him much since Robert's funeral, but he remembered me fondly and agreed to meet for coffee. I told him everything. The laundry on my bed. The word maid. The months of unpaid loans and bills. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked me a simple question that changed the direction of everything. He asked, "Aunt Linda, is your name the only name on the deed?" It was Robert and I had bought the house together, but after he passed, I had inherited full and sole ownership. There was no shared claim, no legal ambiguity, nothing Mark or Ashley could point to and call theirs. The house, every wall, every floor, every single brick of it belonged to me and me alone. David explained, gently but clearly, that legally speaking, Mark and Ashley were essentially guests in my home. Guests with no lease, no legal claim to residency, and no protection if I decided for any reason that it was time for them to find somewhere else to live. I sat with that information for a long moment. Then I asked David to help me draft something. Not an eviction notice, not yet. Something else. A formal letter, the kind that lays out facts in plain, undeniable language. A record of every dollar I had spent on their behalf over the past 8 months, along with a simple, calm statement that going forward, certain things were going to change in my house. I also, for the first time in 8 months, called my closest friend, Carol Whitmore, who lives 2 streets over and has known me since our children were in diapers together. I invited her for tea on a Thursday afternoon while Mark and Ashley were both out, and I told her everything start to finish. The laundry, the word maid, the overheard phone call, the credit card packages piling up in the hallway. Carol sat quietly through all of it, and when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand and said something I have thought about many times since. Linda, she said, you have spent your whole life taking care of other people. Robert, Mark, your grandbabies, half this neighborhood if we're being honest. There is nothing wrong with a woman who has given her whole life to her family finally, deciding that giving does not mean disappearing. You are allowed to protect what you built. That is not cruelty. That is wisdom. Those words settled something in me that had been unsettled since the moment I found that laundry on my bed. Carol had lost her own husband 4 years before I lost Robert, and she understood, in a way that few people can unless they have lived it, exactly what it means to be an older woman whose quiet strength gets mistaken by younger people for weakness, for something to be managed and used rather than respected. She told me about her own daughter-in-law situation years before, a different story but a similar lesson, and how setting boundaries, real boundaries with real consequences, had ultimately saved that relationship rather than destroying it. I left her house that afternoon with my resolve fully hardened into something calm and unshakable, and I drove straight to David's office to finalize the letter. While David worked on that letter, I did something else that I am not ashamed to admit gave me a quiet, fierce satisfaction. I started keeping receipts. Real, physical receipts and bank statements. All the grocery bills, all the utility bills, everything with dates and amounts, organized in a folder I kept locked in my bedside table. I wanted proof. Not because I doubted what I remembered, but because I wanted it undeniable, laid out so clearly that not even Ashley, with all her sharp tongue and quick excuses, could argue her way around it. The final piece of my plan came together almost by accident, though I have come to believe that little accidents like that happen for a reason. About 10 days after the laundry incident, I was folding towels in the hallway outside the guest room, close enough to hear Ashley on a phone call with her mother, whom I had met exactly twice and who lived out of state. Ashley didn't know I was there, or maybe she simply didn't care, because by that point she had stopped caring whether I heard the things she said about me. Honestly, Mom, it's actually perfect, she was saying, laughing lightly. Linda basically does everything around here now. Cooking, cleaning, watching the kids whenever we want a night out. It's like having free help, and she doesn't even really complain about it. I mean, she's old. What else is she going to do with her time? Might as well make herself useful. Mark says she'd probably leave us the house eventually. Anyway, since we're the only family, she has left, so really, we're just getting a head start on what's ours. I stood frozen in that hallway with a stack of folded towels in my hands, and something inside me hardened into pure resolve. It was one thing to be disrespected. It was another thing entirely to hear in her own words that she saw my home, my life's work, my husband's legacy, not as a gift I had generously offered, but as something she was already entitled to. Something she was simply waiting to inherit while treating me like unpaid staff in the meantime. That night I finalized everything with David. The letter was ready. The financial records were organized. And I had made a decision about exactly how I wanted this to unfold, because I did not want a screaming match that the children would remember for the rest of their lives. I wanted something calm, something undeniable, something that would leave absolutely no room for Ashley to twist the story into her own favor, the way I suspected she would try to do the moment she felt cornered. I chose a Sunday evening for what I privately started calling, in my own mind, the reckoning. I chose Sunday deliberately, because Sundays had always been sacred in this house. The day Robert and I used to cook a big dinner together and slow down after a busy week.
A day.
Mark had called me faithfully every week, even during his busiest years at college. I wanted this conversation to happen on a day that already meant something to our family, a day built for sitting together and being honest, rather than some ordinary Tuesday evening squeezed in between errands. I spent that entire Sunday afternoon preparing, though not in the kitchen the way I normally would have. I reviewed every page in David's folder 3 times, making sure every number was correct, every date accurate, because I knew Ashley well, enough by then to know she would look for any small inconsistency to seize upon and use to discredit the whole conversation. I laid out my clothes for the evening the way I once laid out clothes for important meetings decades earlier when I still worked. A plain gray cardigan Robert had always said made me look like I meant business, though I hadn't worn it in years. I wanted to walk into that kitchen looking exactly like what I was. A woman fully in control of herself and her home, not the tired, overworked figure Ashley had grown accustomed to overlooking. I asked Mark and Ashley to sit down with me after the children had gone to bed, telling them only that there were some house matters I needed to discuss. Ashley sighed like it was a great inconvenience to give me 30 minutes of her evening, glancing at her phone as she walked toward the table, clearly expecting some minor logistical conversation about grocery schedules or maybe a complaint about noise. She had no idea, not the faintest idea, what was actually waiting for her in that folder sitting closed on the table in front of my usual chair. Mark, to his credit, seemed to sense something more serious in the air, perhaps from the tone of my voice when I'd asked them to sit, or perhaps simply because he knew his mother well enough to recognize when she meant business. He sat down slowly, folding his hands in front of him, watching me with a kind of wary attentiveness he hadn't shown in months. They sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had written out that long list of numbers weeks before, the same table where Robert used to sit every Sunday morning with his newspaper and his black coffee, and I felt, for just a moment, as though he were somehow sitting there with me too, lending me a little of his old, steady courage for what I was about to do. I placed the folder in front of me. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply began speaking calmly, the way you might read a report you had carefully prepared, because, in a way, that is exactly what it was. I want to talk about the last 8 months, I said. I wanted to talk about what this house has cost, and what it has given, and what has been given back in return. I opened the folder and slid the first page across the table, the one listing every bill I had paid, every dollar I had lent, every grocery run, every utility payment. All of it totaled at the bottom in David's neat handwriting. $11,460. Not counting rent. Not counting labor. Not counting love. Mark's face went pale as he read it. Ashley's expression, on the other hand, hardened into something defensive almost immediately, the way people do when they know they are about to be caught in something they cannot talk their way out of. This is my home, I continued. It has always been my home. Every wall, every floor, this table we are sitting at right now. I opened it to you because I love my son, and I love my grandchildren, and I believed foolishly perhaps that opening my home meant I was being met with the same love in return. Instead, I have spent 8 months being your unpaid housekeeper, your unpaid babysitter, your unpaid bank, and being called, in this very kitchen, the maid. Ashley opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand, and something about my calm, in that moment, silenced her more effectively than any raised voice could have. I also heard you on the phone with your mother last week, I said quietly, about how you're just waiting for me to leave you this house, about how useful I am to keep around in the meantime. I let that sit in the air for a long moment. Mark turned to stare at his wife, and for the first time in 8 months, I saw something other than passive silence on his face. I saw shock. I saw finally a small flicker of the sun I remembered. That's not what I meant, Ashley started, her voice suddenly much smaller than it had been in months. I don't particularly care what you meant, I said. I care what you said and I care what you did, and both of those things have made it very clear. How you see me in my own home. I slid a second piece of paper across the table. This one was the letter David had helped me draft, laying out, in clear and simple terms, new conditions for anyone continuing to live under my roof. Rent, a modest but real amount, to be split fairly and paid on the first of every month. A shared chore schedule written out day by day, with every adult in the house, myself included, contributing equally. Full repayment, over time, of the money that had been borrowed and never returned. And one final line, the one I had insisted on adding myself, word for word. Any disrespect shown toward me in my own home, verbal or otherwise, would be grounds for immediate reconsideration of their living arrangement, with 30 days to find alternative housing. The room was silent for a long moment. Ashley read the letter twice, her jaw tightening with every line, and when she finally looked up, there was real fear in her eyes for the first time since she had moved in, because she understood finally and completely exactly how much power had been sitting quietly in my hands the entire time. Power I had simply chosen not to use until now. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice climbing. "This is insane, Linda. We're your family." "Family," I said, "does not throw dirty laundry on family's bed and call them the maid. Family does not sit on the phone bragging to their mother about free labor in a house they think they're entitled to inherit. I have been more than family to you for 8 months, Ashley. I have been staff. Unpaid, unappreciated, disrespected staff. That ends tonight." Mark finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Mom's right, Ash. This isn't okay. Any of it was the first time in 8 months. My son had chosen my side over hers in front of me, and I will admit quietly that it brought tears to my eyes, though I did not let either of them fall in that kitchen. I wasn't finished, though. There was one more thing I needed to say, because I had promised myself, driving home from Carol's house that Thursday, that I would lay every card on the table at once, so there could be no second ambush waiting in the wings, no new secret discovered a month later that would force us all to sit through this same painful conversation twice. I looked at Ashley directly and asked her calmly how much she currently owed on the credit card she had opened using our address. Her face went a shade paler than it already was. "How do you even know about that?" she said, her voice tight. "Because the statements come to this house," I said. "And because I am not blind, Ashley, whatever you and your mother may think of me on your phone calls. I know about the packages. I know you told my son there wasn't enough money for groceries the same week 3 boxes arrived from a store I won't bother naming. I'm not asking to shame you. I am asking because if we are going to build something honest going forward, in my house, under my roof, it starts with the truth. All of it, tonight, not in pieces over the next 6 months." Mark turned to his wife with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years, somewhere between heartbreak and disbelief. "How much, Ashley?" he said quietly. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Nearly $4,000. She admitted, spread across 2 cards, one of them nearly maxed out, both of them accumulating interest every single month while she told her husband and her mother-in-law that there wasn't enough money for basic necessities." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it that night. I did not gloat. I did not say I told you so, though I will admit some small, tired part of me wanted to. I simply nodded slowly and said, "Now we know everything. Now we can actually fix something real." Instead of pretending the problem was ever about laundry, Ashley tried several more angles that night. She tried anger, insisting I was being dramatic, overreacting to one bad comment. She tried tears, saying she was sorry, that she'd had a hard year and hadn't meant any of it the way it sounded. She tried guilt, bringing up the children, asking where they would even go, what kind of grandmother would put her own grandchildren through instability like this. I want to be honest with you, that last one nearly worked on me, because I love Tyler and Emma with everything in me. But I reminded myself, and I reminded her, that I was not asking them to leave that night. I was asking for respect, for fairness, for basic decency in exchange for the enormous gift I had already given for free for 8 long months. In the weeks that followed, things did not change overnight, and I won't pretend they did, because that wouldn't be honest, and I promise you the truth tonight. Ashley was cold to me for a while, resentful, the way people often are when they've been caught rather than genuinely changed. She paid the rent I asked for, grudgingly, on time, but with a tight jaw and a lot of slammed cabinet doors. She did her share of the chores, but sloppily at first, as if daring me to complain so she could accuse me of never being satisfied. There was one more moment, about 3 weeks after that Sunday night at the kitchen table, that I think finally broke through whatever wall Ashley had been hiding behind. We had a small backyard gathering, Nothing fancy, just hot dogs and lemonade for a few of the neighbors, and two of Ashley's friends who had been coming around on weekends, including the same Kelly who had once heard Ashley call my home outdated. At some point, standing by the grill, Kelly turned to me, clearly not realizing how much I actually knew, and said, laughing, "Linda, Ashley told us you basically run this whole house for free, cooking and cleaning for everybody." Honestly, I wish I had a mother-in-law like that. I felt Ashley go rigid beside me. I could have let it go. Part of me even wanted to, for her sake, because I could see the panic flash across her face. But I had spent 8 months swallowing comments like that in silence, and I decided calmly that the silence was finished. "Actually," I said, smiling pleasantly at Kelly, "I own this house outright, every wall of it. And until recently I was covering the mortgage taxes, the utilities, and quite a bit of grocery money for 4 extra people without a single dollar coming back the other way. We've since worked out a fairer arrangement." I said it lightly, without malice, the way you might mention the weather. But I watched the color drain from Ashley's face as her friend's expression shifted from amusement to visible surprise. Nothing more needed to be said. Kelly didn't bring it up again, but I noticed in the weeks after that, Ashley never spoke about our living situation to her friends in that careless, entitled way again. That backyard moment, small as it was, seemed to be the thing that finally cracked something open in Ashley, more than the kitchen table conversation itself had. I think being confronted quietly, publicly, in front of someone whose opinion she cared about, embarrassed her in a way that a private conversation at home never could have. She avoided me for 2 days afterward, quiet and sullen, but on the 3rd day, she knocked on my bedroom door, something she had never once done in 8 months, and asked if she could talk to me. I invited her in, and she sat on the edge of my bed, the same bed her laundry had once been dumped on, and apologized, really apologized, for the first time since everything had started. But something had shifted, and it kept shifting, slowly, in ways I hadn't expected. Mark started stepping up in ways he hadn't before, doing dishes without being asked, taking the kids to the park on Saturday mornings so I could rest, telling Ashley directly more than once that the way she had treated me for those months was not something he was willing to let slide again, no matter how tired or stressed she felt. I think, in a strange way, that reckoning at my kitchen table woke something up in my son too, some backbone I had feared he'd lost somewhere along the way. But the apology on the edge of my bed that afternoon, sincere as it seemed in the moment, was not yet the deepest turning point of this whole story. That came a little later, about 2 months after the backyard gathering, on a night when Tyler had a bad fever and Mark was working a late shift at his new job, the one that had cost us all so much before it finally started paying off. I had gone to bed early that night, tired from a long day, when I heard Emma crying somewhere down the hall around 11 o'clock. And beneath her crying something else, a low, frightened murmuring that didn't sound like Ashley at all. Not the sharp, confident Ashley I had grown used to. I got up and found her in Tyler's doorway, phone in hand. Hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. Tyler's fever had spiked to nearly 104, and Ashley, for all her confidence about everything else in that house, had never once had to handle a real medical scare completely alone before. Not without her own mother nearby. Not without Mark home to share the fear with. She looked at me in that doorway with an expression I had never seen on her face in the entire 2 years I had known her. Pure, unguarded panic. I did not think about laundry, or bills or any of the 8 difficult months that had come before that moment. I simply became a grandmother, the way I had been a mother once, decades earlier, when Mark himself had run fevers that frightened me half to death. I took Tyler's temperature myself, gave him a lukewarm bath to bring the fever down safely, called the after-hours line at his pediatrician's office to make sure we weren't missing something serious, and sat with him, alternating cool washcloths on his forehead, while Ashley hovered nearby, useless with fear in a way she had never allowed herself to be useless before. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, with Tyler finally resting more comfortably, his fever beginning to break, Ashley sank down onto the hallway floor outside his room, her back against the wall, and put her face in her hands. I sat down beside her, my old knees protesting the whole way down. And for a long while, neither of us said anything at all. "I don't know how you did this alone for as long as you did," she finally said, her voice raw and small, nothing like the sharp tone she had used on me in the kitchen all those months before. "Raising Mark, losing Robert. All of it. I've been so cruel to you, Linda, and you still got up in the middle of the night to help me anyway." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry. For all of it. The laundry. The things I said to my mom on the phone. Calling you the maid. Like you weren't a whole person who gave up her entire house for us. I really am sorry." I told her honestly that words were a beginning but not an ending, that I had heard apologies from her. Before that hadn't held for more than a few weeks. She nodded, understanding, and said she knew that she didn't expect me to trust her right away, that she only wanted me to know she meant it this time, and that she intended to show me rather than simply tell me. I sat down on that floor with her a little longer, without a word about laundry or maids or bills, simply keeping her company until Tyler's fever broke fully around 2 in the morning. Somewhere in those quiet hours, something changed between us, something deeper and more lasting than the backyard confrontation had been able to reach. I won't tell you it fixed everything instantly, because real change rarely happens in one conversation, no matter how sincere. But it was a beginning. Over the following months, Ashley slowly became someone I barely recognized from that woman, who had once dumped her dirty clothes on my bed and called me hired help. She started thanking me, genuinely, for the small things. She started asking my advice instead of issuing instructions. She learned finally and properly how to use my washing machine, and more importantly, she learned to use it for her own laundry, every single time, without being asked. There was an incident about a month after the fever night that I think is worth telling you about, because it shows how far the ripples of that one difficult conversation traveled. Ashley's mother, the same woman she had bragged to on the phone about free labor and an inheritance, already half spent in her mind, called the house one afternoon while Ashley was at the grocery store. I answered, since I happened to be closest to the phone, and the woman, whose name is Deborah, launched immediately into a lecture about how she'd heard from Ashley that I was suddenly making things difficult for her daughter, charging rent, demanding chores, being unreasonable to a young mother trying her best. I let her finish. Then I said, very calmly, that I would be happy to send her an itemized list of every dollar I had spent supporting her daughter's family over 8 months, along with a recording, if she liked, of exactly what her daughter had said about me on this very phone line to her, word for word, since apparently Ashley had a habit of repeating our private conversations. There was a long pause on the other end. Deborah's tone changed considerably after that, softening into something far more apologetic, and she admitted somewhat sheepishly that Ashley perhaps hadn't given her the full picture of things. I told her kindly but firmly that I loved her daughter and wanted the best for this family, but that I would not be spoken about or spoken for by people who hadn't lived a single day of the 8 months I had just come through. She apologized before we hung up, and to her credit, I never heard another complaint filtered through her again. When Ashley came home and I told her about the call, expecting perhaps another flash of the old defensiveness, she instead put her face in her hands and apologized again, mortified that her mother had called at all, admitting that she had indeed complained to Deborah in a moment of wounded pride, rather than honest reflection. Back before that night with Tyler's fever had changed something in her. It was, I think, one more small brick in the wall of real trust that was slowly, carefully being rebuilt between us. Before I tell you about the day they finally moved out, I want to go back and tell you something about my son, because Mark deserves his own part of this story, not just as a bystander who finally spoke up at the right moment, but as a man who had to do some real reckoning of his own. About 4 months after that Sunday night at the kitchen table, Mark asked if he could take me to lunch, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in a long time. We sat at a small diner not far from the house, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never quite runs out, and he was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. "Mom, I need to say something, and I need you to let me get through it," he said. turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. I knew. I knew what was happening in the house for months before you ever said anything. I saw the laundry situation building. I heard the way Ashley talked to you sometimes. I told myself I was staying out of it to keep the peace, that if I pushed back too hard it would create more stress for all of us during an already stressful time. But the truth is, I was a coward. I let my own mother get treated like a stranger's housekeeper in her own home because it was easier than having a hard conversation with my wife. That's on me, not just her. I'm sorry it took you laying it all on that table for me too. Finally grow a spine about it. I told him honestly that I had wondered, in some of my darker moments that year, whether I had somehow failed to raise him to stand up for the people he loved. He shook his head and said that wasn't it at all, that he had simply gotten comfortable letting Ashley run the household decisions, because she was louder about it and he was tired from work, and that comfort had cost me 8 months of quiet suffering. He should have noticed and stopped far sooner. We sat in that diner for almost 2 hours that day, longer than either of us had planned, talking more honestly than we had in years about Robert, about the pressures Mark had been under, about what kind of husband and son he wanted to actually be going forward rather than simply drifting into whatever was easiest in the moment. I left that lunch feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time where my son was concerned. Real hope. After that lunch, I noticed a steady, quiet shift in Mark that continued for the rest of the time they lived with me.
He started speaking up in real time, not just after the fact.
When Ashley slipped into old habits, gently but firmly redirecting her, reminding her of the agreements we had all made together at that kitchen table. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply consistent, day after day, the kind of steady change that actually holds. Unlike the loud promises people make in the heat of an argument and forget by the following week. Mark and Ashley eventually saved enough with the rent structure I had put in place, actually helping them budget better than they ever had on their own, to move into a small place of their own about a year after that difficult night at my kitchen table. The apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms in a decent complex across town, but it was theirs, earned honestly, budgeted carefully without a single dollar of unpaid debt trailing behind them the way there had been when they first moved in with me. I helped them pack on moving day, wrapping dishes in old newspaper the way Robert and I used to do decades earlier. And I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, feeling not relief exactly, but a strange, proud kind of sadness. The way you feel when a plant you nursed back from near death finally grows strong enough to be transplanted somewhere of its own. When they left, Ashley hugged me at the door, a real hug, not the polite performance of one she used to give in those early days. And she thanked me with tears in her eyes for everything, for the roof, for the patience, and most of all, she said, for the honesty, for finally telling her the truth about how badly she had been behaving when she was too blind and too overwhelmed to see it herself. The real test of everything that had changed came the following Thanksgiving, almost exactly a year and a half after that laundry landed on my bed. I hosted the way I always had, the way Robert and I had for decades before that. I set the table with the good dishes again, the same ones I had used the very first night Mark and Ashley moved in. And I found myself in the kitchen that morning, thinking back over the whole strange, painful, ultimately transformative year that had passed since that difficult season began. Ashley arrived early, before Mark even, carrying 2 full dishes she had made herself, a green bean casserole and a sweet potato pie, and she came straight into the kitchen and asked, genuinely, what she could help with, rather than disappearing to the living room with her phone the way she once might have. We worked side by side for almost 2 hours, peeling potatoes, basting the turkey, and she told me, somewhere in the middle of all that chopping and stirring, that she thought about that laundry day often, that it had become, strangely, one of the most important days of her adult life, the day she was finally forced to see herself clearly, instead of through the comfortable haze of her own excuses. I used to think strength meant getting what you wanted, one way or another, she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Watching you that night at the kitchen table, so calm, so clear, never once raising your voice, completely unshakable. I realized I had it backwards the whole time. That was the strongest I had ever seen anyone be. I want to be that kind of strong for Tyler and Emma someday, not the kind I was being before. I told her, honestly, that I was proud of her, and I meant every word of it. Dinner that Thanksgiving was full and warm in a way it hadn't been in years. Even before Mark and Ashley had moved in. Back when it was often just Mark and me at a table meant for 8. Quietly missing Robert together. Tyler said grace that year. Something Ashley had started teaching him at their new apartment. And when he got to the part about being thankful for family, he specifically thanked Grandma, Linda's house, for keeping us safe when we needed it, and I had to excuse myself for a moment to compose myself in the kitchen, overwhelmed by a feeling I can only describe as the purest kind of relief a mother and grandmother can feel, the relief of watching a broken thing mend itself back, together stronger than it was before. I still watch Tyler and Emma every other weekend. Mark calls every Sunday, just like he did before all this began, but there's something steadier in his voice now. Something that tells me he learned, alongside his wife, exactly what it means to respect. The people who love you enough to give everything and ask for nothing, until asking for something finally becomes the only way to save the relationship at all. My nephew David stopped by a few weeks after that Thanksgiving, just to check in the way family does, and I told him how everything had unfolded since that Sunday night at the kitchen table when he helped me put those papers together. He smiled and said something I have carried with me ever since. Aunt Linda, most people who come to me in situations like yours never actually use what we draft together. They're too afraid of the confrontation, too afraid of losing the relationship altogether. So the leverage just sits there, unused, while the disrespect keeps piling up year after year. You were the rare one who understood that having the power and using the power wisely, calmly, without cruelty, is what actually saves relationships instead of destroying them. Most people think standing up for yourself means burning the house down. You just quietly turned the lights on so everyone could finally see the house clearly. That's a very different thing. I have thought about that distinction many times since. Burning the house down versus turning the lights on. It would have been easy, in the heat of that laundry moment, in the fury of overhearing Ashley on the phone with her mother, to simply hand Mark and Ashley a stack of boxes and tell them to be out by the weekend. Some of you watching tonight might even think that's exactly what they deserved after everything I've told you. And I understand that feeling. I felt it too, more than once, alone in my bedroom at 2 in the morning during that difficult year. But revenge built purely on anger tends to burn everyone standing near it, including the people you actually still love. What I chose instead was something slower, something that required far more patience than a single dramatic explosion would have, but something that ultimately rebuilt rather than destroyed. That turned a daughter-in-law, who once called me the maid, into a woman, who now calls me, unprompted, simply to ask how my day was going, because she genuinely wants to know. I think about that day often. The day I found her laundry on my bed. The day she called me the maid in the very house my husband and I built, with our own hands and our own sweat. At the time, it felt like the worst moment of that whole difficult year. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the moment that saved my family. Because it was the moment I finally stopped being quiet out of fear and started being quiet out of strategy. And there is a world of difference between those two kinds of silence. I forgave Ashley fully in time. Not because she was entitled to my forgiveness, but because I watched her earn it, slowly, honestly, through changed behavior rather than empty words. That, I think, is the real lesson in all of this. Love your family with your whole heart. Open your doors when they need shelter. Give freely when you're able. But never ever let anyone, not even the people who share your blood or your last name, convince you that your kindness makes you their servant. Your name on the deed matters. Your dignity matters. And sometimes the most powerful thing a quiet woman can do is simply let the truth speak for itself, calmly, clearly, and without a single raised voice, at her own kitchen table. I know some of you watching tonight are sitting in situations similar to the one I found myself in that year. Maybe not with laundry on a bed, but with some version of it, some quiet erosion of your own dignity happening in your own home, at the hands of people you love and welcomed in with an open heart. I want you to know that setting a boundary is not the same as stopping love. I loved Ashley just as much the night I laid those papers on the table as I had the day she married my son. Love and accountability were never opposites in this story. They were partners the whole time, working together to save something that careless silence very nearly destroyed. If there is one thing I hope you take from this old woman's kitchen table tonight, it is that your years, your labor, your home, and your name on that deed are not things to be quietly handed away out of guilt or fear of conflict. They are things worth protecting, calmly, patiently, and with your whole heart intact. Robert used to tell me, back when we first bought this land with nothing but hope and a stack of borrowed lumber, that a house isn't really made of wood and nails at all. It's made of everyone who is willing to be honest inside it, year after year, even when honesty is the hardest thing in the room to offer up. I think about that often now, watching Tyler and Emma grow up, running through these same hallways their father once ran through as a boy, watching Ashley cook dinner beside me in a kitchen she once thought she was simply entitled to inherit without ever having to earn a single corner of it, watching Mark stand a little taller in his own life, in his own marriage than he used to before all of this began. This house is still standing, free and clear, forever, exactly the way Robert promised me all those years ago at that little Italian restaurant on Main Street. And it is standing not because I gave everything away quietly, without ever saying a word, but because, when it finally mattered most, I found within myself the courage to speak, calmly, clearly, and completely on my own terms. I still sit in that armchair by the window most evenings, the one that used to get pushed into the sunroom corner without so much as a word of warning. It stays right where I like it now, right where Robert first set it down for me all those years ago. And nobody in this house moves it without asking anymore. Small things like that matter more than people realize. A chair staying where you put it. A chipped blue coffee mug staying on the shelf where it belongs, instead of hidden away in a garage cabinet because it doesn't match somebody else's idea of a modern kitchen. Respect often lives in the smallest details of a home, long before it ever shows up in the big dramatic conversations. And I think that is something worth remembering long after tonight's story fades from your mind. Ashley bought me a new coffee mug last Christmas, actually. A plain white one with tiny painted bluebirds around the rim. And inside the box was a small handwritten card that simply said, "For all the mornings you made coffee for a house that didn't always deserve it. Thank you for staying anyway." I keep that card in the drawer beside my bed, next to Robert's old watch, and on the harder days, the days when I still remember exactly how that laundry looked, heaped on my white comforter, or exactly how cold her voice sounded the moment she called me the maid, I take that card out and read it again, slowly. And I remember that even the hardest, most painful chapters of a family's story can, with enough patience and enough honesty on both sides, become the very thing that ends up saving it in the end. That's my story, the whole truth of it, exactly as it happened to me. If you made it all the way to the end with me tonight, thank you for sitting with an old woman and her memories. Now I want to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from. Put your city down in the comments. I promise I read every single one, and it truly warms my heart to know how far this story traveled and who was listening on the other end tonight, whether you're sitting in a quiet living room after a long day, or lying in bed with your phone propped up on the pillow beside you, or maybe even out on a porch somewhere, listening while the evening cools down around you. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you spend this time with me. And if this story moved you even a little, if it reminded you of your own grandma, or maybe even yourself, do me one favor before you go. Hit that like button, subscribe, so you don't miss the next one. Because I have many more stories like this one still waiting to be told. And share this with someone who needs to hear tonight that it is never too late to stand up for yourself. Even in your own home, even at 71 years old, even when the person disrespecting you is family. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And take care of the people who quietly take care of you. Because more often than not, they are carrying far more than anyone around them ever bothers to notice.